Alright, in this lesson we're going to take a look at how we can use render elements to separate our renders into different passes. Alright, so when it comes to rendering out your final images, the idea is to try to render this out in a way that gives you the freedom to come back and make changes to the render without actually having to come back and re-render anything. So the way that we do that is by separating these different elements out into their own passes. So color pass, reflection passes, lighting passes, things like that. Now, what we can do with render elements is just very quickly achieve those types of effects. So let's go to the render setup. We'll take a look inside the render elements tab. And this is where we can actually add these particular elements. So when you look at this, you can see this very long list of different elements. Alright, so you may be wondering, what is this really that I'm looking at? Well, what happens is at render time, all of these different things are being calculated. So whenever you render, the diffuse is being calculated, the lighting information is being calculated, any reflections, refractions, shadows, all this stuff is calculated independently at render time. So Mental Ray will think about the reflectivity of an object, its shadow casting capability, any things that are coming out of that, and then each time it thinks, it layers more information on top until we get our final render. Now what the render elements does is it takes all of those different calculations that Mental Ray's already doing and then just separates those out into their own images. Alright, so let's take a look at this. Let's add, for beginners, let's add a diffuse layer so we can get basically just diffuse lighting information back. Now there's a few things that we can do with this. If we take a look at diffuse, there are actually some options for some of these different render effects. So if we come down with this diffuse element selected, we have the option to include lighting information into this. So that way we can actually get some of these shadows and some of these highlights in these diffusely lit objects. In my case, I actually want to turn that off because we can actually output a separate lighting pass that will contain that information. Again, just gives us the freedom to come back and make those changes. Alright, now with this lighting selected, again, if we scroll down a little bit further, we have the option to include direct lights, indirect lights, or shadows, or we can include all three. Now in my case, again, I like to try to separate this out as much as possible, so let's maybe make this contain only direct light, this lighting pass, and we can actually give this its own special name. We can call this direct light, and that way whenever I render this out, we'll have our own special name for this so we can actually recognize what this is going to be. Now let's add in maybe another lighting element. Now on this one, let's turn off everything except indirect lights. So with indirect lighting, the information that's going to be thought about in that would be things like final gather, global illumination, or in this case, photons for caustics. So with this one, we should now have the caustics separated out. And we'll call this, again, something like caustics. Alright, so let's add some of these other options in here. We want to make sure that we get reflections, and we want to make sure that we get refractions, shadows. I could just control click and add several of these at once. And we really don't need anything like Z-depth. We'll probably need a matte, so that way we can actually mask some of these things out, but we also have, again, lots and lots of different options. Material IDs, lighting information for really just about anything, HDR data. If you're using the architectural shaders, you have the ability to output all these different elements. Really lots and lots of freedom here. So we can add all these together. And let's just come in and make sure that we don't need to make any adjustments on this. This shadow pass is one that we need to address, because you can see right now its filtering is turned off, which means we're going to get kind of this jagged line, which you really don't see here because the shadows are being filtered at render time. So we need to make sure that with this shadow enabled, enable filtering, there we go, so that way we'll get a nice soft shadow. Reflection should be good. Now with the matte, again, we can actually kind of use this as a mask. So with this one, let's select the matte, scroll down, let's turn on the include and then we just choose the objects that we want to be included in this mat. So let's maybe use that to isolate the bottles. We'll take our 3 bottles, move them over into the Include column, hit OK, and now whenever we render, we should have now an isolation mat of those objects that we included. Alright, so that should be everything that we need. Diffuse, direct lighting, we have our caustics contained in here. Alright, looks like everything is good to go. So once we have all this set up and we're ready to now output our final image, we just go up to Rendering, take a look inside the Batch Render. Let's add a new viewport, and we'll call this something like Render Elements. That'll be the name of the actual path, or the actual pass. We really don't need to necessarily give that a name if you don't want to. But then we can define some kind of an output path, and it's going to go to the render output directory of your current project. And we can call this something like Render Elements, or anything that you want. So we have to define a file name for these files to be named as, and we also have to define some kind of a file format. You want to make sure that you define something like a Targa or a TIFF, something that will let you use an alpha channel. And save, we want to make sure that we're using 32-bit alpha channels. And when we're done, just hit render. So now you can see it's going to go through this process of just a normal render, but behind the scenes it's going to now separate out all these different elements. So this is really the beauty of using these render elements, is the fact that we have the ability to now separate all of these different pieces into their own pass, but you'll see that really we don't add any extra render time, so it's really kind of the best of both worlds. We just have the ability to now have independent control over these things once this render is finished. And what we'll start to do in the next lesson is take a look at how we can take all of these different passes that have now been spat out by this render elements and actually composite these back together using any kind of a compositing application. Right, so we'll take a look at that in the next lesson.